will start because it is already recorded, it can be shared with students. There'll be one less excuse to not be exposed to the lecture. So, and working some rules that you need to transcribe what I'm talking about. Of course, I'm sharing slides with notes pages, so but I often talk about things that are not in the notes pages. So the question is that a whole lot of these things are happening today, right? And there's the Kashmiri lady, who's a doctor who's been caught. There is the terror network was apparently operating from Faridabad. There are links to Lucknow. Now, the Cabinet Committee on Security is going to be called after the Prime Minister returns from Bhutan tomorrow. All these things are happening and you can get excited about this. But the question is that if you want to understand why terror happens, right? You may need all of this data. You might need to know about these things, but it's a very different kind of situation, right? So you go to a party, you have drinks, you want to appear smart, you can tell people that, oh, you didn't know about this. It's like saying that, oh, you didn't know that in that football game, that guy played well, and how did that person play well? So you're a bit of a nerd, So you can, one of the ways in which you can be impressive to yourself and to others is the fact that you know many things about many things. But if you really want to become a boring kind of guy and want to try to find out why these things happen, then it's not like you don't need to look at these data points, but you actually try to look at the same data from a very different perspective. So if you really want to handle terror, you actually have to know why terror happens. It's not good enough to say that these terrorists are there and they are bad people and we'll hang them. You actually have to find out why terror happened. Because today there is some terrorist attack, tomorrow there'll be another terrorist attack. If people who want to be terrorists have reasons to provide to terror, of course you have to improve the security network within the country. You have to nab terrorists, all those things. So, for example, in Pakistan, the Taliban was created by the regime. Today, the regime is fighting Taliban. There was this big attack on the army public school. Where? In Islamabad or Lahore? Where was it? In Peshawar, right? It was a big thing. And when the army public school was attacked, then, people really took this question of attack seriously. Because, the terrorists had entered the hallowed borders of the place where the Pakistan army sends its children. Now, if you want to deal with these things, it's not good enough to know who was the terrorist, how did the attack happen. It is very important to know how were these terrorists created. How have they reached the situation? I mean, the terrorist attack is taking place today in front of Red Fort, near one Sunehri Masjid, in the heart of the city, near the metro station. Of course, the terrorists want to destabilize the state. No question about that. But the question is, if you want to deal with terror, you actually have to know why does it happen. So, for example, in Kashmir, a lot of people who might have actually become a part of the regular political process in India became terrorists because I think in 1987 or in 1989, there was a highly rigged election. And the election was rigged, and this was during Congress party rule when Rajiv Gandhi was still Prime Minister of India, not under any right-wing so-called BJP dispensation, but it was rigged to such an extent that many people who might have tried democratic politics turned terrorists. So that is a kind of a causal argument. I'm not saying that that is correct, because I'm not the expert, that you did not give enough possibilities within a democratic regime, so people didn't have an option and turned terrorist. And Shumit Ganguly writes this book called The Crisis in Kashmir. There's an article in International Security where he argues that the people who actually turned terrorists are people who went to good schools in India, to the Jawaharlal Nehru University. So they actually saw how Indian democracy works. and they got exposed to ideas of liberal democracy. But when they found that those very ideas that were being taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I was both a student and a teacher, were not being practiced on the ground, they began to do some things that probably their previous generation would not do, because they felt that deprivation, because they had actually seen the functioning of Indian democracy and the double standards that were being performed in Jammu and Kashmir. So if you understand that this is at the root of the problem of terrorism, then when Prime Minister Vajpayee came to power under a BJP dispensation, followed by, India's approach to Jammu and Kashmir became far more liberal. I mean, people were allowed to cross the border to Pakistan, and they decided to come back. They actually found that their life in India was not so bad. And Kashmir became a far more peaceful place. So what I'm saying is, whether you're trying to solve a research problem or whether you're trying to solve a policy problem, and yesterday we had a lecture by Professor Rudra Sil from the University of Pennsylvania in our research colloquium, which was actually addressing some of these issues, that you need to have not only a deep historical understanding of the context, but you must have a kind of an understanding. I mean, you can be a police officer and say, oh, I need to know who all these guys are, who are these terrorists, and then let's nab them and we'll solve the problem. You won't. I mean, look at what's happened to drug laws in Germany. They have actually legalized drugs in a very regulated way in Germany. So you can not buy drugs, but you have these vereins or these clubs where drugs can be produced locally. And each verein can have a membership of, let's say, 6,000 members. So the whole idea is that a lot of things were happening illegally. Now you want to stop. You could have gone like Singapore, right? You could have said that anybody who is caught with drugs is going to be hanged. And this is literally what Singapore does. There was a guy who had drugs, is Australian. The Australian Prime Minister appealed, but he or she was hanged. This was when I was living in Singapore. That's a very different way of handling, and I'm not so sure that Singapore has solved the problem of drugs. Germany's way of thinking about this was, okay, we don't want to encourage cocaine, but how do we deal with it? Like there is a football verein, like there are different types of clubs in Germany. So let us have these clubs, which are highly regulated spaces, which work for a certain number of people who live in German cities. So there is a certain population with which you can get a verein, and there is a limited way in which you can actually grow drugs and keep a certain amount in your pocket, right? So this is a way of trying to understand how do you solve the problem of drugs. And obviously, they must have done a lot of research. They've tried to find out why people get addicted. You could have also taken the view that cocaine is a good thing, and you don't try to solve the problem of drugs. You could have taken the view that, terrorists are good because, after all, they are doing very good things. They feel very deprived, and they're going and hitting and bashing up places. So one of the things is you have to decide what is your dependent variable. Why does it concern you? Which can be terrorism or drugs or whatever it is. And the other thing is, the question is, how does that dependent variable vary as a result of the causes that produce the dependent variable? So to go back, and this is a problem I find people coming for the MA oral exams and they can't figure out the difference between a dependent and independent variable. This is very sad for me because it almost feels like I talked for 2 years, but I could not get this basic thing into people's heads, that there are certain things that may be causing things to happen, and there are certain things that happen as a result. Because they happen as a result, they are dependent on what the causes are. Therefore, the causes are independent of the happening, and the happenings are dependent of the causes, and both vary, right? So, I mean, this is just a prelude to what I want you to get into right now, which is subversive activity, which is, we started by looking at social theory. How do you take social theories apart? That's what makes an interesting social scientist. An interesting social scientist is not a person who says, yes, sir, this is a brilliant idea. Yes, sir, this is a great idea. But an interesting social scientist is that Okay, this was a great idea, but why do I see these things happening, which I can't seem to find an answer for? When you get that Archimedes moment, when you discover buoyancy, where nobody knew that there was buoyancy when you go into water, that's when you have an interesting moment. And we will try to discover how you get there. But do you have any questions up to this point? Are you following the lectures? Everything seems to be going all right for you? Good. So in a way, I will actually just give you some examples of scholars who actually produced puzzles that uh, have held sway over a long period of time. And once we are able to understand how you get puzzled, in the next class, we will begin the work on research design. That you have a problem. Now, how do you deal with it? That is when case selection will arise. So I will go back to the story of Durkheim regarding mental illness. So Durkheim, as you know, is a great sociologist, and one of his path-breaking works suggested that the conventional wisdom regarding suicide, like I talked about terrorism right now, right? So terrorism can also have a sociological theory. So he was concerned about suicide. So again, as I said, every researcher needs a fact. And in his concern about suicide, he, like this prickly kind of person, was not convinced that the prevailing dominant idea about suicide, which was that mental illness causes suicide, was actually correct. So the whole idea was, maybe schizophrenia will cause suicide. There are many mental conditions that can drive you to suicide. So, so the whole onus of suicide then becomes the individual, right? Think about if mental illness causes suicide, I am depressed, my wife is not treating me well, my children are not treating me well. Uh, for many years, life was great. And then, I feel that why is it that I should live? I did everything for my family. So one day I just stand in front of an Autobahn, a Deutsche Bahn train and take my life. It happened. I mean, this is not a story, right? Deutsche Bahn delays are often because of people who come underneath or, I go on top of a cliff, and jump into the ocean. And then you will begin to think that suicide is a bad thing, which is connected with maybe, this problem, this person was not strong enough to deal with, this family situation. Or maybe he was depressive. Maybe he was not treated for depression, I'm not saying that mental illness can't cause suicide. I'm just saying that Durkheim was not convinced that mental illness causes suicide. And he was convinced that suicides have a better sociological explanation. And his, the dominant idea was that it is individualism which produces suicide rather than mental illness. So the more individualistic you are, the more easy might it be for you to take away your life, because you're not attached to many things apart from yourself. And feeling that you are worthless is an idea that can come far more quickly if you are individualistic. So Durkheim was A, not convinced that mental illness was the problem, and B, he thought that there was an alternative explanation. So puzzles actually come often with alternative explanations. I mean, everybody saw the ball fall, but we never thought about gravity. Gravity was the explanation. They all just accepted descriptively that a ball falls or that a pen falls. But they never questioned the idea that the ball will not fall in the same way on Earth as it will fall on the moon, as it will fall in the sun. Because there is something about the density of the planet which produces, and maybe the distance between planets that produces a pull which is called gravitation. So, having understood that perhaps there is an alternative explanation, which is individualism, he then had to convince the rest of the world that he had actually an Archimedean moment. Right? So that is when, so he actually then had to operationalize his hypothesis into empirical statements that could be tested. So then the next question that arises is that, okay, if mental illness does not produce suicides, and we are convinced that individualism does, then how can we measure individuals? We know how to measure suicide. That's not a problem. There may be data about deaths, there may be data about suicides. Whenever somebody commits a suicide, maybe the police will note it as a suicide and not as a murder or not as a natural death. So the data on suicides is available. So you can know whether there are more suicides in one city or less suicides in one city. You can find out whether there is more suicides in some populations or less suicides in some populations, right? So treating suicide as a dependent variable is not a problem. Question is, how do you test individualism? And there, Durkheim converted his theory into empirical statement or proposition or hypothesis, saying that we can look at some population as being more individualistic and some populations as being more solitary. So how do we judge these populations? So he argued that Protestants are more individualistic than Catholics. Catholics are more communally organized than Protestants. He argued that the Jewish people are a very solitary people. They are very well organized as an intrinsic group. So then he said that maybe I should find more suicides among populations that are less solid, right? Less well knit as a community. So then maybe I should find more suicides among Catholic people, among Protestants, than among Catholics. Maybe I should find. He also argued that people who have a higher level of, maybe I should find fewer suicides among Jewish people, because the Jewish people perhaps are even more solitary as a group than the Catholic population. And then he argued that there are also other modernization variables that produce individualism, like education, wealth, all these things can produce individualism. So he then told you that there is a way to understand that certain populations can be more individualistic, certain populations can be less individualistic. And then individualism as an independent variable can be tested on a dependent variable called suicide. Making sense? So how would you test that? Any idea? If you have come this far, how would you test? Yes.
The case study?
Yeah, case study, yes, but what would be your case?
But I take these different, I make up different groups, maybe just 10, Protestant, Catholics, Jewish people, depending on what your reference, reference is.
Right.
And then I make that into groups.
You can't interview people who have committed suicide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't get too carried away by case studies.
But maybe the survivors.
They are cases, yeah. We are not looking at survivors. Don't complicate the story. We are looking at dead people who committed suicide. No, but you were headed in the right direction, yes. And this is exactly what he did. So he he compared the Catholic population in France and Germany with the Protestant population in France and Germany. And he actually showed that the Catholic population was less suicidal than then he compared data between married and unmarried people. And he showed that married people tended to commit fewer suicides. Because if you're not married, then the assumption is that you haven't been able to get along with a partner, right? And if you haven't been able to get along with a partner, then you're like the probability that you have solitary attachments which will keep you going are less. So he conducted his experiments on Catholics. He didn't have to do an experiment. He just had to look at the data. So he would look at the Catholic population in France and Germany. He would look at the Protestant population in France and Germany. He would look at the data on married and unmarried people. But he also set up a critical experiment. And this is a very interesting idea. That if you read the Lakatos piece, if you have the patience to read the Lakatos piece on the philosophy of science, it's worth doing it once in your lifetime. I can tell you that. I mean, it's again not true, but there is this whole idea of a crucial experiment. So in a good experiment, what you do is you take a case which is very convenient for your opponent theory to for your opposing theory to be proved right. That's called a tough case. And sometimes scientists call it a critical. And a tough case is actually very good when you're doing just case studies based on qualitative material, because you don't have a large number of cases, and we will talk about this in the next class. So he said that my critical case is the Jewish population, because the Jewish population has a lot of things that go with individualism, and yet they are the most solidary group. They are rich, they are well educated, and therefore many of the factors that drive individualism are present in the Jewish population. But we know that the Jewish population is a very well-knit population. So what's interesting is that in Jewish families, in a wedding, you will probably find a lot of people invited. I mean, I'm talking about, so, they might be in Germany or in the United States, but they connect a lot with relatives. They connect a lot with friends and family. And so there are solidary networks which keep the community together. It's a relatively small community. And he found that the suicide rate among the Jewish population was actually less. So for Catholics, it works, but even for the Jewish population, it works. And in this way, what Guttheim was able to do was to show that you have a real problem with this conventional wisdom that mental illness causes suicide. Right? So what is it that I'm trying to tell you? How do you get puzzled? You get puzzled because you can see that the conventional wisdom is saying something, and you have a very strong view that it may not be right. And in order for you to understand that it may not be right, you actually then start looking at an alternative. And that alternative then, I mean, I've almost given you a research design lecture over here. He has a research design. But this intuition that mental illness, maybe, he just went and checked the records for suicides among Catholics and Protestants in France. Maybe that's how it started. He said, all right, we know how Catholics live and we know how Protestants live, and let's see whether it works. And much later, as he started getting so you then try to understand not only what your theory is, you try to make empirical statements that cover a large range of different types of populations. And then you're sort of, but the initial understanding is that there is something in the conventional wisdom which is problematic. Yeah. Any questions? Make sense? So now you will start getting puzzled, you will not really accept conventional wisdom. Okay. Another great example is the reading that I teach in many of my classes, including the comparative politics class and the development class, is the reading, and therefore it is worth reading. Because if you read it once today, this time around, it will help you for the rest of the work. Is this classic piece by Hamza Alavi about state formation in the post-colonial setting, which is Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, Hamza Alavi is basically a Marxist scholar, very well-paid Marxist scholar, who is historically very inclined. So if you read this piece, which was published in the monthly review, you will find that, Hamza Alavi actually knows what's happening on the ground in Pakistan. He's not just a theoretician. I mean, he knows as much as a journalist, a good journalist would know. And of course, he is a very theoretically minded person. So when he is writing about the post-colonial state in Pakistan in the early 1970s, in the late 1960s, being very grounded in an understanding of Marxist ideas, like Durkheim, he is puzzled. And why is he puzzled? He's puzzled because in Marx, the state was once called the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, which means that, Marx and a lot of European thinkers thought that capitalism was so important and the rise of capital was such an important phenomenon that if you really want to understand what the state is doing and how policies are playing, you really don't need to do much other than look at the nature of capital, which means the nature of industrial class. So the state in Marx, in one understanding of Marx, becomes what people in English call epiphenomenon, which means that it can actually just be derived from a very powerful actor in society, which is the capitalist class and the nature of the capitalist class. Later on, when Marx looked at the state in France, he actually also made arguments about the fact that the state should be considered as an actor, as a variable in trying to in determining policies which may not be easily understood from what the capitalist class wants. And in that framework, he argued that the state works not like the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, but like an actor that ultimately works in the long-term interests of capital. So there is one way of thinking about the state that, just look at conflicts that take place within the capitalist class. Like Lenin argued that the state was ruled by monopoly capital. Monopoly capital was the marriage of finance capital and industrial capital, which had grown to a large scale of production. And industrial capital that was producing a large scale of production wanted to keep growing. But by that time, finance capital had also arrived. So there were banks. And these banks had an incentive in investing in these capitalist enterprises, which are industrial capital. And because these capitalist enterprises could get more and more finance from finance capital, they began to grow even more. So finance capital also began to grow because they had invested in industrial capital. Industry and industrial production also began to grow because they had finance. And this marriage of finance capital and industrial capital, which Lenin called monopoly capital, was the reason why imperialism happened. Now, I'm not saying that Lenin was the only one. There are other arguments about imperialism as well. But that's an argument which actually shows that the state is epiphenomenal. I mean, if you really want to understand why policies are being made, you have to understand what the capitalist class wants and the nature of the capitalist class. So Lenin would say that the nature of the capitalist class has been transformed from smaller level of industrialization, where, maybe feudalism was kind of attacked, and you got from a feudal kind of an enterprise to a capitalist enterprise, factories, commercial farms, where labor was no longer bonded in the same way as under slavery or under feudalism. There was wage labor, there was exploitation. And then slowly it reached a stage. And Lenin does a beautiful description of how industrial capital grew, how finance capital grew, and then he showed the correlation between the variables. He said that, look, these are the number of bank branches that Britain has in its colonies. These are the number of bank branches that France has in its colonies. And these are the number of bank branches that Germany has in its colonies. And look at the expanse of its colonies. So he varied the independent variable, which is monopoly capital. Monopoly capital was not happening because of imperialism. So it was independent. But monopoly capital was producing imperialism. So that was dependent. And then, why am I giving you these stories? Because that is a classic example of applying Marx. But applying Marx in his definition of the fact that capitalism is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. So if you read Lenin, then you will find that you really don't need to know anything else about a state. You just need to measure the extent of monopoly capital and you'll know the extent of imperialism. Very important policy can be derived from variations in an independent variable. So these are the kind of arguments that existed. And then Hamza Alavi actually found that the state in Pakistan could not be derived from capital in the same way as Lenin or Marx were suggesting, that there was something else that was happening to the state in Pakistan, which he called the bureaucratic military oligarchy, which he argued had a degree of relative autonomy from both the metropolitan bourgeoisie and the indigenous bourgeoisie. So in capital, when you're looking at post-colonial societies, you have two kinds of capital. One is the indigenous bourgeoisie, which is the capital that resides within the country, industrialists that come from the home country. And metropolitan bourgeoisie are the industrialists who come from abroad. So this is foreign direct investment. So he said, if you really look at the interests of the foreign direct investors and of domestic capital, you still can't square up why the Pakistan state was doing things in the same way as Lenin could understand why monopoly capital produced imperialism. So what I'm saying is that here you have a kind of an Archimedean moment, right? Once again, like Durkheim. Why is Hamza Alavi puzzled? Hamza Alavi is puzzled because he understands that there is a Marxist theory of the state, that Marxist theory of the state derives so much from, the importance of capital. And like Durkheim, who found a problem with mental illness, he actually finds a problem with the Marxist theory of the state. And what does he find? He finds that the state in Pakistan is actually overdeveloped. It is overdeveloped in the sense that the state plays a more active role in promoting its interests than does any class within the state in Pakistan. And this state is something that he calls the bureaucratic military oligarchy. So then he says that, what are the politicians doing? The politicians are basically people from these different ethnic communities. They could be Sindhis, they could be Bengali, He was writing this article in 1970 or 71, very close to the time when Bangladesh became independent. So there was a lot of demand from East Pakistan. There was a lot of demand from Sindh. There was demand from Northwest and things like that. There were all of these ethnic demands that were being made from different parts of Pakistan. And basically what happened was that in order to deal with these demands, I mean, you would give some voice to these demands of the politicians. But in order to deal with these demands, and especially after 1958, you got General Ayub Khan coming to power. And General Ayub Khan ruled for about 10 years, from 1958 till about 1968. And during that period, and including the period after him, when General Yahya Khan came to power, you had something called basic democracy or partyless democracy. So the whole idea was that what was considered to be democracy, I mean, General Ayub did not launch his own party, was highly guided by the power of the military. And then he says something very counterintuitive. He says that, in 1971, when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto becomes Prime Minister of Pakistan, one would think that, democracy has become very, very vibrant in Pakistan. But he says that is a wrong conclusion to reach, because in 1971, the military in Pakistan has become hugely discredited because there's a war with India. And the war with India has actually led to the division of the country into two different countries. So this is the time, so two things could have happened in 1971. Let's say Pakistan was truly democratic. We know that an election was conducted by General Yahya Khan, right? And in that election, the one who had the overwhelming majority of seats was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman of the Awami League Party from East Pakistan. So the Awami League Party from East Pakistan had something like 160 seats. And the Pakistan People's Party of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had less than 140 seats. So then, I mean, to General Yahya Khan's credit, I think the elections were conducted free and fair, and the results were there. But West Pakistan was not willing to accept a prime minister from East Pakistan. So let's say Pakistan was really democratic, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman had become the prime minister of Pakistan. I don't think the country would have been divided, right? I mean, he wouldn't have had any incentive to divide the country. Sheikh Mujib had placed 6 points before the ruling elite in West Pakistan, saying that you have to respect these things regarding Pakistan. And the man who had placed those 6 points on the table was the man who was supposed to become the Prime Minister of Pakistan. But what happens instead? The military becomes discredited and the country becomes divided. And in that divided, the largest party is Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto becomes the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So the way in which Hamza Alawi is interpreting this history is by arguing that don't think that Pakistan became suddenly very democratic because Zulfikar Ali Bhutto became Prime Minister of Pakistan. In fact, he says that he installed a man called General Gul Hassan as the corps commander of Multan, who was himself a contender for Yahya Khan after General Ayub. So General Ayub rules till about 1968. Then he has to be removed. General Yahya Khan comes. Gul Hassan was a contender. And that same contender, Gul Hassan, is actually made the general. So, and then Gul Hassan, so one is that Gul Hassan is made, and then Gul Hassan is replaced by General Tika Khan. And General Tika Khan was a powerful hawk who replaced Gul Hassan at the behest of the military. So the thing is that, you might go with the view that, democracy came and it was very vibrant, but actually it was not. And then finally, when the military was not happy with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, he was hanged. I mean, he was just plain hanged. Democracy only returned to Pakistan after the end of the Cold War, when the United States did not need the US Pakistan military to the same extent that it needed during the Cold War, when it had to fight the Mujahideen and the Taliban. Taliban was created to fight the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So he's, of course, Hamza Alavi doesn't know all these things because, he wrote the piece in 1971, but we know that the military has not become less powerful over a period of time. So essentially, the basic point is that that despite the fact that General Ayub Khan created some business houses, there's this story about the 22 big powerful business houses that controlled the Pakistan economy. The fact of the matter is that the business class in Pakistan was never that powerful, according to this experience. However, hidden in the story is a very powerful landed class in Pakistan. I mean, it doesn't become very explicit, but if you read it very carefully, you will find that there's a very powerful landed class. And the landed class is very powerful because it is feeding the military and the bureaucracy. So the BMO is a kind of a class basis, which is not so much in the capitalist class, but in the feudal elements of the landed class. Agriculture is not taxed and all that. So he reads out a story where he argues that the metropolitan bourgeoisie or the economic of capital is very powerful. It's not like it is not powerful at all because Pakistan is dependent on foreign aid, on foreign, guns and weapons. And obviously that comes with some influence. And then there is some influence with domestic capital. But even then, the guy who is on top is really the bureaucratic military all about. And he argues that this is not the kind of argument that Lenin could make in imperialism about the rise. So you can't say that the metropolitan bourgeoisie is defining Pakistan. You can't say that the indigenous bourgeoisie is defining Pakistan. You can't say that the indigenous bourgeoisie and the metropolitan bourgeoisie have shaken hands with the landed class and is defining Pakistan. You cannot say that the state is working in the long-term interest of capital, because Pakistan, if you can see, is a country which has enormous potential in agriculture. It has the largest cotton growing part of the South Asian region. It was the breadbasket of the Indian subcontinent. But the maximum exports are taking place from Bangladesh. Bangladesh has become the second or the third largest exporter of garments to the world, even though it doesn't produce cotton. That means what? The interests of the business class in Pakistan are not rewarded. I mean, cotton growing is easy and it benefits the landed class. But converting that cotton into ready-made garments doesn't have the kind of incentive that, let's say, India or Bangladesh gives through its textile manufacturing. I'm telling this story for you to understand that, let's say, you had a Bonapartist state where the state was working in the long-term interest of capital. Then maybe it would not have listened to exactly the needs of what ready-made garment exporters need, but would have had a long-term vision of how to grow the ready-made garment store and would have done things which were propitious. So, for example, that is what India did in 1991. In 1991, the business class in India did not want the economic reforms that took place. But the Indian state wanted to promote the business class. So they did things that you would say is in the long-term interest. So Narayan Murthy, who is, let's say, the founder of Infosys, one of India's leading IT companies, he said that, of course, the government gave some benefits in the 1980s. But if you compare with what happened in 1991 with the devaluation and the deregulation, then, 1991 is in a different planet altogether. The way in which the Indian IT sector could grow. But there was not a lot of push from the IT sector or from the rest of the sector that was substantial to promote. In fact, the Indian state had to devalue the currency, reduce the tariff against a lot of political opposition that came from the sector at that point in time. They had no idea that they would become so rich. That is more like a Bonaparte state, a state that is working in the long-term interest of capital, but you have to understand the state as being different from that. Hamza Alavi is arguing that Pakistan is not even there. And he is still very valid because, Bangladesh has produced a garment sector, India has an IT sector, has a pharma sector, has an auto component sector. Sri Lanka has a very vibrant garment and apparel sector, it has a very vibrant tourism sector. And Pakistan, with all these things, you must have read in the political economy of development class, has only military foundations, which are ruling its business. So that means, something like worse than Iran has happened in Pakistan. That the military is so entrenched that it is not even letting the business class grow. So this is the kind of idea that Hamza Alavi is trying to promote by arguing that this is a real process. Capital is supposed to be important in defining the state. And here we find that the state is not getting that. It's a little bit like saying that suicide is not getting defined or being impacted by mental illness. Yes. Yeah, I would argue that it was taken as a long-term vision in a different paradigm. So, and that's why if you read my book, you'll find there's a chapter on 1966 and there's a chapter on 1990. So the long-term vision in 1966 was very different. But globalization and economic deregulation have become far more apart. And I showed that the government releases many reports, starting with a very important report in the 1979, in the mid-1980s, where the state is actually criticizing import substitutes. And then the state is also doing a large number of things, which makes you understand that the vision it may not have become the only vision that was there, but it had come to dominate the state in a much bigger way. So there is an IT policy of 1980, there's an IT policy of 1984, there's an information technology of 1986. Then there is the dilution of the monopolies on the State Practices Act. There is a gradual devaluation of the Indian rupee that is taking place. So when India suddenly devalues its rupee in July 1991, it's not as if they have not experimented. Of course, the leftist economists think that it's going to be a disaster, but it very quickly makes India the largest trading partner of Sri Lanka within a few years, displacing Japan. Because if you can actually start doing trade with your neighboring countries, then you become even more cost effective. Why would they buy motorcycles and cars from Japan when they can get from India? So this was a long-term vision. And of course, you can say that the long-term vision was kind of facilitated by a balance of payments crisis, but that's the reason why I actually keep the balance of payments crisis common in both the cases. You say that the balance of payments crisis, despite the balance of payments crisis, India became even more adaptive after 1967. So Mrs. Gandhi's policy from 67 to 74 was far more regulated, and she was far closer to the Communist Party and the Soviet Union than Nehru ever was. Nehru actually thought the communists were a threat. He was a liberal at heart, so he was socialist, but he would not give up political liberalism, and that's what he was for. But Mrs. Gandhi was far closer, and then I argue that from 75 onwards, there are reasons to show that she herself becomes disenchanted with that. It's not a question of being right and wrong, and of course, the fact that East Asia has grown and all of these things have happened, obviously are also impacting, the policy makers. But it's not like she can do a thing, because And that's why I am a firm believer in coalition. And in, what is right or wrong can be decided. But if you have a farmer's lobby, if you have trade unions, then in 1991, some people may have wanted to be more severe with trade unions, but you could not. Some people may have wanted to privatize all kinds of industry. You could not, because it all happened within a fairly wide field. But I think that there was a certain kind of consensus that, and that is really what is more like a long-term interest of the state, where the state and the bureaucrat become an independent body. Yeah. So makes sense, right? This kind of puzzlement with the bureaucratic military oligarchy. Good that we also brought in the India case. Similarly, there is a very good book by Amit Ahuja, who has looked at backward caste movements in India. And he is puzzled not by a mainstream theory, but by empirical facts that most people would easily believe, and he thinks that these are not happening. So he looks at the states where the most vibrant backward caste social movements have happened. And he says that these states are Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. And he's focusing on the most backward caste. That is the caste of the Dalits. So there is actually a backward caste party in Tamil Nadu, which is the DMK in power today. But the DMK, India is a very stratified society. And backward castes can also be very dominant in the social structure. And the DMK party, while it is a backward caste party, is actually very oppressive towards the Dalits, the most oppressed caste within India. So Amit Ahuja says that, you had a very powerful backward caste movement, which was led by a man called Periyar, very, very powerful ideology of anti-caste. But there is no Dalit party, which is important in Tamil Nadu. I mean, Tamil Nadu is a very progressive state, and they have a backward caste party. I mean, it is not a right-wing Hindu nationalist state. On the other hand, there is Maharashtra, where there has been backward caste movement, where Dr. Ambedkar himself, the great sort of chairman of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, was really the first Dalit. I mean, you can't just call him a Dalit intellectual. He was probably one of the greatest legal scholars of his time. Got a PhD from Columbia, then got a degree from London. Became a part of the cabinet, then resigned from Nehru's cabinet. And even before him and after him, there, Dalit mobilization was tried in the state of Maharashtra. So you can see Maharashtra. Maharashtra is here and Tamil Nadu is here. But Ahuja says that the fact of the matter is that real Dalit parties have actually arisen only in two states, which are very backward states, which really haven't had that kind of a situation. And those states are India's heartland states, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Uttar Pradesh now has a right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP in power, and Bihar has an ally in the Janata Dal United Party, which is now going for election. So, one set of voting has just happened, and this is a very interesting and exciting time for anybody who's following Indian politics, because Bihar is a very big heartland state. Depending on how the voting will go, things will happen. That's an aside. But there is a Lok Janshakti party in Bihar, which captures Dalit vote. It's not a very big party, but it has been significant. And it has operated. It was led by a man called Ramvilas Paswan, and now his son Chirag Paswan is in the cabinet. And in Uttar Pradesh, you actually had the most successful Dalit party ever, which was the Bahujan Samaj Party. Bahujan means many people, or I guess the people who are the many people, the common people. Samaj is society. The society of the common man party, Bahujan Samaj Party. So the Bahujan Samaj Party actually came to power. It's politically not so significant right now, but its leader is highly compromised, probably because of corruption charges, and therefore she is not taking on the BJP. That's the current situation. But historically, Mayawati, who is a Dalit and a woman, actually became the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. And this was a huge movement. It started, it led to, even today, if Mayawati says that her party will contest elections, a lot of Dalit votes will go to her party. And sometimes these kinds of parties can take votes away from some other parties. So let's say if the Congress gets a lot of Dalit votes, and if the BSP puts a candidate, it's easier for the BJP to win. Because Congress historically has got the Muslim and the Dalit vote, and now there is a party of the Dalits. So the whole puzzle is, why does this happen? That, you have states where there are these social movements which have historic significance, and there is no Dalit party. And Amit Ahuja says that the reason for this is that perhaps where you have a social movement, you will have to provide what in social science, governance discipline, political science, we call programmatic sort of welfare. It means that you have to provide good housing, better jobs, more real welfare. But in places where these social movements have not happened, symbolic appeals are given. So, Mayawati belongs to a caste called the caste of the Jatas. Jatas are dominant even the Dalits have subcastes. And there is a subcaste called Jatas, which are dominant in the typical community. So if a Jataka knows that another Jataka is dominant, then they will go to that. That is good enough. Because they just feel more secure that there will be a Dalit person representing them. In fact, we had this lecture by Narendra Kumar on governance. And he said that it actually translates into more, they're feeling more secure in the presence of representatives who belong to their own class. In fact, Narendra Kumar actually presented in the colloquium, and one of the key central messages of that paper also was we had looked at districts in Haryana and we had looked at districts in Haryana and in Uttar Pradesh. And he said that in the welfare provision in Haryana might actually have been better. Haryana is a richer state. But Dalits felt more physically secure when there was a Dalit leader. There's a book that Kantin Pandra has written on this entire conundrum, and she actually says that makes an argument that is very similar to the Amit Ahuja argument, which is that Dalits vote Dalits because you can't actually be very rational about who will be your best representative. It is easier to track a person who belongs to your caste because it is in the name. And when you track a person who is your own caste, it is easy to make that selection, and caste groups vote caste. So if you're following the BJP Bihar elections, you will also find that caste is very different. Who is going to get the backward caste vote, who will get the extremely backward caste votes, who is going to get the Dalit vote, who is going to get the upper caste vote, who is going to get the Muslim vote. There's a huge debate as we talk about it today. If you just follow this debate, you will understand what I'm saying. So the conundrum here is that you actually have to provide welfare when there are social movements. But when there aren't social movements and you mobilize a Dalit party, you can just make Dalits feel more secure. That's the argument. And that actually creates this situation where, in the absence of a real, most backward caste social movement, you have Dalits in power. You can counter this by saying that, look, I am really puzzled, Mr. Ahuja. There was Kanti Ram and there was a social movement. Maybe all the things that led to the creation of the BSP can be considered. I'm not saying this is right, but I'm saying that you're a Hamza Alavi and you know as much about Dalits as he knew about the bureaucratic military oligarchy. You might come up with a different argument, but he's taking on a different kind of an understanding. And he's obviously puzzled. He says that, look, there are social movements and there are no parties. And there are no social movements and there are parties. How do you explain? So that's how he produces a party. Any questions?
Yeah. So, but no other party has ever come to power only on the basis of only those four. So when we are talking about movement, state and non-movement state, it cannot be argued that where there has been no movement, there is a chance that those Dalit parties would also reach out to the other sections of the society in order to be able to become members. Like when we are talking about Bahujana Samaj Party. The tagline that they've ever won the election is like, Aati nahi Ganesh and Ganga Vishnu Mahesh. And they've tried to build a consensus among upper caste voters as well as Dalit voters to win anything. So no single party just on the basis of Dalit ethnic votes have won, because within the Dalit votes there are other subsections. There are other backward castes, there are SC votes, within the SC votes there are more different substructures. So it can.
No, that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. That in fact, and that's why I said Mayawati's coming to power sole person in 2007 or something is a really historic thing. Because just the Jatak votes don't add up. So for example, I mean to elaborate, right now, elections are taking place, right? So in Bihar, there is a party called the Rashtriya Janata Dal, which, like the DMK in Tamil Nadu, is a backward caste party. So upper caste people don't vote for it. But they are a backward caste with a Yadav element in it. And Yadav are very, let's say, a strong backward caste. I don't know whether you can call it dominant caste like the Lingayats and Gopalikas, but they're a strong backward caste. They're really not backward in that respect. But they have they consider themselves to be backward, and there has been almost like a backward caste movement in Bihar. And it's an old thing. It started with Kasturi Thakur. And today, the Rashtriya Janata Dal, which was in power in the state for many years, will try to garner the backward caste votes and the Yadav votes. Right? Now, the Lok Janshakti Party, which is a Dalit party, is aligned with the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP for the same reason. Here, what is happening is that they have a small vote, maybe 5% vote, right? So they can get a few seats. Now, let's say, so now the politics in Uttar Pradesh is such that you have the BJP, which cannot win elections on its own. And you have the Janata Dal United, which is also a kind of a backward caste party, which is very, very influential. Now, the BJP is in coalition with the Janata Dal United. And it is that playing that game with the Janata Dal United because it knows that it cannot come to power without the Janata Dal United, but it wants to, like it has done in many other states, finish that part. So there is a situation where the Janata Dal United, the current chief minister belongs to the Janata Dal United. They have not yet recommended a chief ministerial candidate. And this guy, Chirag Paswan, of the Lok Janshakti Party, is sitting with his 5% vote. Now, what will happen is that, suppose there is a close tie between Janata Dal United and BJP coalition, and you need those 5 seats to come to power. Then, Chirag Paswan's 5 seats will become very important. And, he might even become the deputy chief minister. This is what I'm saying, that in this kind of first past the post system, you might actually get into that situation where now, I don't think Amit Ahuja can claim that Lok Janshakti Party can produce a chief minister. But I think the point is making is that you have a Dalit party. You don't have something like the Lok Janshakti Party in Tamil Nadu. You don't have, Ambedkar was himself there, his son is there, but he's almost become a BJP guy. Ambedkar, the great reformer. And the RSS is at heart an upper caste organization. So that's the point. So I don't disagree with what you're saying. Also, the point that you're making about the BSP is a very important point, that the BSP also cannot easily come to power on the basis of that affair. So it has aligned with the BJP sometimes. It tried aligning with the Yadav. There is another Yadav backward caste party called the Samajwadi Party. And on the ground, it is actually the backward castes who oppress the Dalits. And they find that alliance more difficult than actually the most oppressed groups aligning with the BJP. But despite these things, and of course they have needed the cooperation of upper caste groups, because without that they cannot win. Despite this, the point I think Amit is trying to make is that they have a party, and that party is influential. I don't think he's trying to make the point that, Mayawati can become the chief minister tomorrow or the prime minister tomorrow. But Mayawati could become a prime minister if she is less scared about the corruption and stands up against the BJP in a situation where there is no leader. I mean, she would easily be a prime ministerial candidate. So point one is making is that all of these things you're saying are absolutely right, but in a country where there are so many different coalitions and leaderships, there is a Dalit party. Not that party can come to power on its own. And actually, in the case of the BSP, it has been able to come to power on its own and rule a whole period of time. So that is the point. But one can't disagree with the fact that, and that is also aided by the fact that there is a Jatav population. So the caste nature of that party is very clear. So you can't go beyond that, but you can't take that away from it. And from what Narendra Kumar from JNU, who himself Dalit, argued, was that people feel more secure. People who are Dalits feel more secure with a Dalit party in power, even when it does not provide all the development inputs that, let's say, a Congress party and the Tuda could provide to Dalits in Haryana. I mean, that was the central point of today. But, it's good that we are thinking like this, because then you can start asking questions. So you have to know the basic thing of what you're studying. Then you can ask these questions.
There are more like contributions within those parties, like PDC, PDP, PDA,
Right.
it's similarly, Bihar, we are talking about CNY, and this is the Muslim Yadav coalition. When BJP says it's Mahina Yuva. So there used to be many social structures and many social divisions that need to be identified. And unlike Chirag Paswan, you said, he already has a pre-poll alliance right now with 2018.
So the basic point that is being made here is that, your caste affiliation or your subcaste affiliation is producing electoral results rather than what you're delivering on the ground. That's the basic point. And in fact, you are corroborating that. So I'm not saying that is going to be forever right or that we should not challenge it, but I'm just trying to give you what the causal argument is, and that may not go against what you are saying, because he's actually just saying that, look, these parties are significant, and the significance of the parties. I mean, Ramvilas Paswan didn't carry a huge movement. I mean, he was a part of the Jaipata Saran movement, as was maybe L.K. Advani or Narendra Modi and many other socialists. But he was able to appeal to his caste. Mayawati was able to appeal to her caste. And it is not so much to do with social movement. So that is the conundrum. And that is why I think this book is very significant. Doesn't go against what you said. But I'm encouraging you to go against.
Now we have Prashant Kishore movement.
Now you have the Prashant Kishore movement. But the Prashant Kishore movement is trying to transcend the caste thing, because the upper caste people, so there is a new party called the Jan Suraj Party, which is where India's great, let's say, poll consultant, like he has worked with many people, including the Prime Minister of India, on elections, but he has a good track record of making chief ministers win. Now he's launched his own party, but he's an upper caste Bihari. Now, upper caste Bihari, population-wise, is not a very big proportion or a winning proportion of the population. And he's actually trying to make the welfare argument that people don't have education, people don't have health, there are no investments, and Biharis are migrating. And I'm going to address these. And he's saying, I may not win, but I may win. Now, somebody like Prashant Kishore will probably take away votes from the BJP because the upper caste would, just like, Mayawati will take away votes, Dalit votes from the Congress, he can take away upper caste votes or let's say the more progressive welfare-oriented votes, which may not be associated with the BJP. But it is to be seen. And that's why the election is very interesting election. Bihar is also very interesting case. Okay, so let me conclude with the last. So, yeah, I'm getting fine in terms of time. So the last puzzlement I want to talk about is Terry Berman's work on the rise of the National Social Democratic Party in Germany, which was Hitler's party. So Sherry Berman actually argued against a lot of liberal scholars like Tocqueville, even Weber, Putnam, Fukuyama, Benjamin Barber, and others, who try to celebrate civil society. They say that once you have a civil society, you have an oppositional state, and once you have an oppositional state, democracy will be protected. It's a little bit like saying that the bourgeoisie will be democracy, the Barrington Neo kind of. And she takes on scholars. She actually says that, civil society was very, very active in Germany when the National Social Democratic Party rose. And she goes against arguments by people like scholars like Hannah Arendt and William Kornhauser, who talk about the birth of a mass society, which was alienated as a result of rapid industrial and economic growth in Germany. So there are people like Hannah Arendt and others who said that industrialization caused alienation and this actually helped. So she says that look, neither of these arguments work. These arguments don't work because there was a very active civil society, and this civil society cannot be seen as Hannah Arendt's alienated mass society. And despite this active civil society, you got the rise of the National Social Democratic Party. So this is like her life's work. She also now has a book. So she says that Germany's civic space was rather much active. It is called Vereinswahl, or in English translation with associational fetishism or mania. This associational passion was even present in the revolutions of 1848. You remember there are lots of protests and revolutions of the common people. I mean, just go to Prague and many other places. 1848 will show up in the old books. What were the people doing in 1848? So the issues that concern people range from education to land preservation to myriad of things that we should include bird watching as well in the different forms. The next part was in the 1870s, after the setting up of the German Reich. The fight over protectionism consolidated this movement and the Great Depression even so. So you have to understand that Germany was faced with two separate kind of adversity. One was that there was the Treaty of Versailles, which was not very magnanimous towards Germany, and then there was the Great Depression. So if you go to the National History Museum in Berlin, you will get the story. You will actually get the story that Hitler did not rise because of Hitler. You will get the story that every museum is like a book. You go to a museum, you should study in the book. It's not like it's somebody's perspective. And the perspective that you get is that Germany had all these kinds of stories. There was the Great Depression, there was the Treaty of Versailles, things, the economy was profiting, and then you had the rise of fascism. But he says, yes, all of these things were there because Germany faced adverse international conditions. But he says that the real reason why the NSDAP could rise was because politics and political parties were restricted to narrow groups such as workers, landowners, large industrialists, Catholics, etc. So there was a defined narrow group that came to dominate political parties in Germany. And the political system set up in 1871 widen the social fusion. Bismarck tried to marry iron and rye. Iron is industry and rye is agriculture. The lower and middle classes were increasingly getting mobilized. In the 1890s, the Social Democratic Party and the Catholic Centre turned out to be a club of notables. The National Liberals also failed to produce a political platform that would include the diverse elements for rising middle classes. So in a way, what we're saying is that conventional political parties were narrow, and they got narrowly focused on their certain groups that were supporting them. At a time when society was actually becoming quite vibrant, and so when political institutions failed to provide succor, citizens turned to other modes of association like to express themselves. Instead, they turned to folk-sparring or people's association. I mean, there are football clubs, there's something called the Chapel, which provides all kinds of things for relatively poor people. There are all kinds of clubs in Germany where people participate. So, you find children in Germany playing rugby, and somebody is producing a volunteer in a club to train youngsters in rugby. Somebody is training these youngsters in football. You have all kinds of clubs in Germany. By the 1920s, Germans increasingly became part of these clubs and increasingly abandoned the liberal party. Private associations were seen to offer exactly exactly that where political parties had failed. Thus came about an association of World War I veterans called the South Helm. It became very powerful and played a role in Hindenburg's election adjustment. It started losing membership in the late 1920s, largely because Germans were getting radicalized. The National Social Democratic Party filled this vacuum using the space created by these parties. They could use the civic associations to fill the void created by the Great Depression. Activists became the backbone of the Nazi propaganda machine. The number of Nazi members parties which crossed the European group. They even infiltrated a large number of bourgeois organizations. In the late 1920s, they even began to infiltrate rural organizations. Thus began the capture of the Reichsland by R. Walter Dahl. The paper argued that narrow political parties, and especially at a time of economic crisis, could not accommodate the active civic space that had emerged in Germany. The NSDAP, therefore, successfully filled this gap by penetrating the civic space, which should be the boulevard for protection and consolidating. So basically, she's taking on this whole idea of an active civil society as which comes from the bourgeoisie producing democracy kind of idea. I mean, you can have social capital ways of thinking about democracy and development. You can have more capitalism produces bourgeoisie and democracy kinds of ideas about thinking about development. But she's taking all of this by arguing that this active civil society can actually become a space for right-wing or pro-nationalist organization. It belongs to everyone. And you've seen that in India as well. So today, the BJP has the RSS. And the RSS is far more active than any national party's civic arm. And therefore, what the RSS on the ground can carry to the people in terms of Hindu nationalism has much greater reach. The only thing in India is that India has a lot of groups which may not belong to the Congress party or the oppositional space, but they are still there. And they come together, even though they don't have a platform like the RSS. So it's not like the counter groups are not there, but they are not as organized as the RSS is, as a space which largely tries to promote Hindu nationalism. So it's a very similar kind of a comparison. Here, the NSDP did not have the RSS, but what the NSDP did was that it found in these Parain a very easy way to penetrate German society, which the other political parties took on. There is some very good writing in sociology which takes on this kind of an argument and argues that Italy had a more vibrant civil society than had Spain. But fascism in Italy was also stronger than its. And that sociologist, I forget their name, published in the American Journal of Sociology, you can actually even do a comparison within the country, that those parts of Spain which had more active civic spaces actually had more fascism. So this body of writing is taking on this rather optimistic view of the civic space, that you just have a civic space, and you have a civil society, and you get along. No. Political actors have to work on that civic space. Civic actors have to be mobilized in a way, and only then can you fight across activism. So this is another way in which she is actually taking on a big puzzle, because Germany is rapidly industrializing, it's highly modernizing, civic space is becoming very vibrant, and yet you pressurize everything. That goes against all the things that Barrington Moore has said. So how do you explain that? So these are sort of some of the examples I thought to belabor and dig home the idea that no matter what you say, or how can you find that, or what you think very deeply about, can you find that to be problematic in terms of conventional wisdom? And if you find that problematic in terms of conventional wisdom, how do you take on conventional wisdom? And when you take on conventional wisdom, the next step is how do you take it on? So this is what I only find the problem. So that is why we call this lecture puzzle. The next lecture how you make empirical statements like those sound suggested, and then take them to pieces to make the. Thank you very much.